Understanding crowd dynamics. Crowd dynamics and crowd control in retirement communities requires a delicate touch and can be considered to be something of an art form. Even though these audiences tend to have minds of their own, they are generally very patient and generally, thankfully, very forgiving with most performers. Most interruptions and disturbances in your shows can be powered through without breaking your performance flow. Most. You will occasionally hear cell phones ringing if you don't tell them to turn them off before the show. However, many residents need to get calls for medical purposes and so forth. The residents may need to deal with these loudly. However, these are minor disruptions, really, as far as your show goes, and it's kind of part of performing at retirement communities. You should continue your show while they handle the situations. If possible, as much as possible, pretend like it doesn't bother you. Sometimes residents will launch into stories between your songs. One common situation that you may encounter is when a resident raises their hand to make a song request, but instead they launch into a long, meandering story. Now, this is really sweet when it happens, but it's also your show, so you need to handle this. And here's how you handle it. When this happens, the best approach is to stop what you're doing and listen to them and nod your head. However, the situation can become awkward because sometimes other residents might recognize that that story is going on too long, and they want you to get back to the show. They want you to continue. So you might observe one of two different responses from the audience. First, they may remain polite and listen along to the story, especially if it's a good story. Sometimes residents have very good stories to tell. In which case, again, nod along and give them the floor. However, sometimes the other residents are put off by the interruption. They want the show to continue. They don't want to hear the rest of the story from the other resident. Sometimes they will let the other resident know, and sometimes they will just listen, even though they don't want them to continue. If the other residents tell the other storyteller to wrap up their tale, naturally, sometimes they'll do it just like out of habit. They might not even recognize that their story is rambling. The second option to me is actually preferable because in this situation, you do not have to interrupt their story, which could come across as rude, and I don't want to risk losing the audience over something like that. The audience needs to like you. However, there are some situations where intervention is necessary. Sometimes you need to intervene more directly. These situations are, well, an example of this situation is when a resident may be experiencing a memory care issue. Maybe they're telling the same story for the second time. Maybe it's rambling. Maybe they're asking the same questions. And these are a little bit more nuanced situations. They might be in independent living, but it's obvious they're having a memory care issue. You should handle these situations with great sensitivity. Here's how I do that. I might say something like, hey, that's really great. You know, we need to get back to the show now, so let me go ahead and play the next song, and then maybe later we can talk about this, or something like that. Or maybe we can talk after the show if you have time. This approach acknowledges their contribution while at the same time redirecting attention back to the show. It's very delicate. You don't want to accuse them too confrontationally that they're repeating themselves. Now, this type of gentle intervention helps you to gather the chaotic energy in the room and direct it back to yourself, which is appropriate since you are the entertainer and you should be in the spotlight. This is your job. It's your job to entertain. It's also your job to rein back the attention when it gets out of hand, when a senior tells a story that gets out of hand. Now remember, sometimes their stories are great, in which case it's up to you to decide. And of course, in either situation, be polite and nod and give them the floor. But if you can tell that the audience is groaning and wants you to get back to the music, it's up to you to do that.